One of the biggest decisions any playgroup has to make is what kind of setting, style, or genre their campaign is going to be. So in this list, we'll be looking at some of the best campaign settings that you might want to run for your game. And start us off at number 10, we have the Spirited Away campaign setting. This campaign setting seeks to take a party that exists in a world that is familiar and whisk them away to a very specific, often extra planner, location to fulfill some important task or purpose. This is often associated with creating a fairy tale aesthetic, drawing from legends of being lost in the woods and appearing in the Feywild or something similar to it. But it doesn't have to be fanciful or whimsical. A famous campaign setting that falls under the Spirited Away style would be Ravenloft. The Wizards of the Coast campaign module Curse of Strahd uses Ravenloft as one of its most popular and successful examples of this. It revolves around dark fantasy and monster horror for its aesthetic. But at its core, it follows the same basic plotline, whereas the players are stuck in an unfamiliar realm that they can't escape from until they fulfill some purpose or subvert whatever is keeping them trapped there. This is the go-to style for creating a fish out of water setting, or to shock, surprise, and mess with your players' expectations. Usually these settings are fairly small in scope. For instance, in Curse of Strahd, there's an impenetrable fog that contains the realm of a few small towns, ruins, temples, woods, and a castle. This helps to keep pace and focus on a fairly concentrated path without having to improvise much railroading to get the characters into the plot. It creates its own motivation, as most characters aren't really interested in being forced to stay in a place that's potentially deadly and corrupting their natures. These kinds of campaigns are also excellent for a shorter or limited series of games. If your group alternates dungeon masters after a few sessions, then a small-scale world to explore is quite fitting. It's also a way to test out world building on a smaller scale, as this alternate plane or place can be completely distinct from the main setting you usually run. And at number 9, we have Science Fantasy. Over the years, Wizards has printed a few rules, spells, and general support for playing Dungeons & Dragons system in a modern or even futuristic setting. While the core gameplay is still inherently heroic fantasy, adding in high science or technology allows you to vastly alter the complexion of the game. A science fantasy campaign setting is largely in the vein of popular media like Star Wars, and there's even a Star Wars 5th edition conversion system that keeps the 5th edition rule set while applying it to the futuristic setting. A noted example of this in action is Dimensions 20's Starstruck Odyssey campaign, an alternate wacky and morbid example of the science fantasy campaign style in action, or if you want something more official, a recently released Spelljammer Adventures in Space. This lets you use the skeleton Dungeons & Dragons to approach different topics or plotlines. Things like space travel, truly alien races, artificial intelligence, transhuman technology, dystopian surveillance states, and all sorts of other topics you usually only find in science fiction settings are now unlocked to you in the same game that still embodies heroic fantasy with Dungeons & Dragons. Science fantasy plays as a hybrid with other campaign styles, as at its core, it's purely a setting and backdrop, while explicit gameplay mechanics and styles can be adapted to fit whatever futuristic setting you imagine. If you're a bit tired of purely sword, sorcery, and the anachronistic medieval world building that D&D campaigns and modules default to, then perhaps try out a science fantasy setting for your next campaign. Breaking into number 8 spot, we have the Monstrous or Evil campaign. This is often thought of as only evil character campaigns, but it also covers campaigns where players play monstrous races or beings they normally couldn't play due to character creation restrictions. The monstrous side of it requires a lot of work and communication before the game starts, so one player isn't playing an adult dragon, while another player thinks being a sentient gelatinous cube would be fun, thus creating a party that doesn't really work. But once you get past that hurdle, this style of campaign opens up an entirely different avenue of play and progression in an otherwise familiar system and world. The players might get to fight against groups of heroes seeking to invade their lair to undo their evil machinations. And we can't have that. There aren't any great examples of 5th edition campaign modules yet, as this concept was somewhat developed over a long period of time into companion books for older editions. Though there are modules that allow you to progress with a less than morally upright party, like the previously mentioned Curse of Strahd. Another way to play it is to have the players represent some kind of necessary evil that protects the world's current status quo. A great example of this is in Forgotten Realms, which is the main universe where the majority of the Wizards of the Coast campaign modules take place. There they have the Blood War, which is detailed in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, Entry of Devils, and it is a never-ending war where the lawful evil devils of the Nine Hells hold off the oncoming hordes of chaotic evil demons from the Abyss. And should the Lords of Hell falter or fail, an endless tide of demons might overwhelm the rest of the planes. This is why devils bargain for souls, as they need as many soldiers to stop the rise of the demons as they can get. This can be scaled down to something more local for the evil or monstrous players to uphold, while still allowing them to stand their ground and fight back against goody two-shoe heroes who seek to stop them. A friend of mine had a campaign where his party was leading their kingdom of war of conquest to unite the world against an evil that sought to destroy it. But while their goal was noble, they were only really doing it for power and because they didn't want to die. If you want a complete 180 in narrative and perspective, then let the players be the bad guys next time. And at number 7 on this list, we have the Dungeon Crawl. Dungeon crawls are perhaps the oldest way to play Dungeons & Dragons. It's in the name after all. A dungeon crawl usually revolves around a party having to go into a dungeon to find a particular plot-relevant object or creature. In the early editions of D&D, the goal was just to go into a dungeon, find as much treasure and gold as you could, and get out alive. You would even gain experience points based on how much value and gold you retrieved. Modern dungeon crawls are more about creating a trap, monster, and puzzle-filled series of challenges for the players to navigate their way through in order to find their way to their goal. A famous, or perhaps infamous, example of old-school dungeon crawling is the Tomb of Horrors, a module designed expressly to punish and challenge experienced dungeon delvers who thought regular dungeon crawl modules were too easy. A fair and more modern example would be the Lost Mines of Pandelver, the go-to introductory module for new players produced by Wizards of the Coast for 5th edition. Or if you're looking for something in between the previous two examples, there is the Tomb of Annihilation module, which is inspired by the Tomb of Horrors but isn't quite as unfair. Also, spoilers, the dungeon crawl portion only accounts for the second half of the adventure, so as to not exhaust players with the concept of a super dangerous dungeon. There's plenty of other dungeon crawl adventures produced by Wizards of the Coast for all levels of styles of plays. It's one of the most popular and most easy to design campaign styles, making it perfect for modules. Dungeon crawls are great for dungeon masters who like to prepare a fairly linear set of encounters and circumstances the players more or less have to interact with, without having to railroad players, as the railroad is built into the concept, as the player's only path forward is to go down the route, further into the dungeon. Despite its simplicity, dungeon crawls are great, easy to execute, challenging, and interesting for both players and dungeon masters. Coming in at number 6, we have plane hopping. A plane hopping campaign revolves around the party jumping from one dimension, universe, or plane to another. It's a frenetic style of gameplay where any session can not only be a shift in setting, but even a shift in tone or goals. Plane hopping jumps you from one problem to another, leaving little in the way of overarching plot and is more focused on a problem of the week kind of progression. This serialized approach is often great for a party that is just out to have some fun together and isn't looking for deeply rooted narrative growth or character development. This is great for dungeon masters who love putting together a lot of short, interesting scenarios, but might have problems or lack an interest in doing world building or narrative build-up that a more traditional campaign might entail. Plane hopping is also a great way for a party that starts at high levels to begin their campaign. You don't have the same levels of progression and growth for the characters, so you accelerate that by increasing the pace, being able to completely change environments so you can change the skill threats to match how powerful a high-level party may or may not be. Plane hopping is also a good transitional campaign style to go into after a more traditional campaign has been going on for a while. If the players are more or less done with their regular world, then exposing them to the vastness and intricacies of the multiverse is a great way to keep them interested. There aren't many dedicated plane hopping modules designed by Wizards of the Coast, though the Dungeon of the Mad Mage and Tales from the Yawning Portals anthology style is a close approximation. Also, if you're looking for a good source material on different tones and challenges from other planes, there are a few extra planar flavored modules like Out of the Abyss, Descended to Avernus, and The Wild Beyond the Witchlight for good reference material. If you want fast-paced, high-powered, high-variance fun, then you should maybe try out a bit of plane hopping for your next campaign. And at number 5 on this list, we have the City Crawl. City crawls are a fairly popular campaign setting. The purpose is to keep most of the action and drama largely located in one central place, usually the biggest, craziest city in the world. The hallmarks of a city crawl are political intrigue, faction-based quests and alliance systems, and a very tightly controlled area to explore. You can put everything the players could ever want at their fingertips so long as they make their money and reputation to obtain it. Wizards' colleges, mercenary guilds, church congregations, the government, police, the military, merchants, dock guilds, artisans, any faction you can imagine can play a big role in the city, and more importantly, related to the goals and motivations of particular player characters. These factional differences allow you to even create healthier inter-party drama, as different factions appeal to the interests of different players, putting them at odds with each other. The big motivation is that certain factions will have things the players want, either for personal goals, moral similarities, or just character progression and improvement. And interacting with these different factions will have consequences with other factions for the players to deal with as they navigate the political landscape. Despite the name, a city crawl doesn't have to solely take place in the city. City crawl works well with other campaign styles, as they can evolve into hub locations for players to go on other quests from before returning. But at its heart, a city is a complicated and bustling environment with a lot of different avenues for progression for players as they climb in social status and relevance amongst the big movers and shakers. The world revolves around the city in a city crawl, and the players are rewarded and challenged for dealing with the gravity one way or another. A good introduction idea to a low-level city crawl is the campaign module Waterdeep Dragon Heist, from where a low-level party is torn between multiple factions trying to obtain the same treasure, with the players as their best option to get it done. A good example of a city crawl that could help flesh out your own ideas is Cyberpunk 2077. The game itself may have issues as your character is almost above the conflict, That type of factional warfare is perfect. Also, the Ravnica campaign setting in which the entire world is a city divided between a number of great guilds and all sorts of strange creatures to encounter. Matthew Corville even has a whole series of videos where he talks about how he built the city he used in his city crawl campaigns, Change of Acreon, and shows you how he prepares it. If your party loves social maneuvering, intrigue, non-linear story progression, and centralized world building, then a city crawl might just be the campaign for you. And at the number 4 spot, we have a war campaign. War campaigns operate on an entirely different scale and dynamic than regular Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. They are usually set either right as a war is brewing, or in the midst of a war, and that's where all the drama and action revolves around. Instead of a specific location or specific genre dominating, war campaigns are all about the ongoing tension of the 2 or more sides in an open conflict and how the players handle it, usually as neutral third party to the conflict, but eventually picking a side. It also allows a dungeon master to include larger scale tactics and more inventive use of big spells or items that often don't have a place to shine in regular campaigns. Things like Instant Fortress or Mighty Fortress have significantly more relevant purpose, when being able to effortlessly drop a stronghold in the middle of a key location might change the course of a battle. War campaigns are often about how the players maneuver through whatever political strife has caused the war, and then lets the players loose in the conflict itself. This is a great place for mid to high level players to show off their stuff. Heroic deeds in classic literature are all about heroes saving the day or making great sacrifices in times of war. It also helps to harken back to some of Dungeons & Dragons' origins, as the game started off as a spin-off of medieval wargaming. The battle maps, miniatures, turn-based combat, and even things like hit points in D&D all have their roots there and can readily be applied in modern D&D. There's even some third-party D&D content that seeks to bridge this gap even more dramatically, so if you're really interested in running a large-scale, war-based campaign, then maybe take a look at MCDM's Kingdoms and Warfare for a rules expansion book. At its core, war campaigns are about the players interacting on a scale and magnitude greater than just the stats on their character sheets, and can really let them shine in a unique way that other campaign settings can't. You can also pull a bit of a twist on the traditional war campaign by setting the players in the middle of a war, but have them not actually be part of the war. This is used excellently in movies like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly to contrast how small personal problems can feel in the face of war and the large-scale death it brings. At number 3, we have the post-apocalyptic campaign. So, the world has ended, someone's got to live in it, and that might as well be your party. A post-apocalyptic campaign usually leans heavily into a few themes and mechanics. It naturally lends itself into a low-resource, high-danger world as people struggle to survive after the effects of whatever cataclysm caused everything to come crashing down. This makes it a perfect kind of campaign for a more dark fantasy-inspired narrative. A modern comparison might be something like the Dark Souls series of games as far as tone and narrative go. On a session-to-session basis, the players struggle with the threats of dying or dead land and the morally questionable world they live in. This can make good characters struggle to maintain their ideals, and evil characters might succumb to the worst sides of themselves. Beyond that, this campaign setting has a distinct and compelling overarching plot point of just what caused the apocalypse, or why it was caused. War of the gods, a wizard's ambition gone too far, a natural disaster, exoplanetary invasions. Sometimes it's more than just one thing, as multiple problems could have combined together to make the dour situation of a post-apocalyptic world. Either way, this root cause is a compelling plot hook for players to follow as they struggle to survive in this world. Perhaps the most famous Dungeons & Dragons example of a setting like this is the Dark Sun universe in Dungeons & Dragons' pantheon of settings. It's a world where magic gone wild caused by power-hungry wizard tyrant created untold and irreversible damage to the world. If you're interested in a darker tone shift for your more traditional heroic fantasy, then a post-apocalyptic campaign is one of the best places to start. And at number 2 on this list, we have the West Marches. Also known as a hex crawl, a West Marches style campaign is designed around a few basic premises. The original West Marches campaign was designed by Ben Robbins, and the main features are threefold. Firstly, players go out and search an unknown environment, uncovering different sections of a map and hexes to mark their progress. Secondly, the entire campaign is modular and generated almost like a roguelike style video game. The DM usually creates a series of random encounters for different environments in the West Marches, and the players encounter them as they explore, usually rolling on a table. You can see a lot of this design in many modern Wizards campaign modules whenever traveling is involved. A table of random encounters will be rolled on for players to experience to help break up the monotony of travel. Thirdly, after a short while, usually one session, the players will return to a hub town and the status quo will largely go back to normal for the next group. This creates a style of campaign that forgoes an overarching plot for an overarching environment. Survival, exploration, and the mystery of finding unknown things in an unknown land are the driving force in the game. One of the biggest draws to the West Marches is that most of the preparation is done before a game is played. A table of encounters, a few set landmarks placed throughout the map, and usually a resource management system. This means you can schedule a game at any given time and open the map, put whoever shows up in the group, and let them go exploring. In the original West Marches game, Ben Robbins designed this style of campaign to allow him, as a single GM, to manage games for a group of 10 to 14 people with random conflicting schedules. There was a hub town where the mini characters would live in between games and put together improvised parties to play at any time whenever enough players could get together for a game. It puts players in control of scheduling and creates a sort of metagame as players leave behind info on parts of the map that they've explored for future combinations of players. Dangers they couldn't handle, interesting encounters they couldn't figure out the first time, odd landmarks, uncovering the map is the plot progression. What one group couldn't accomplish, maybe the next one could. The players are small fish in a big and extremely dangerous pond. A modern example of this is the first half of Wizards of the Coast campaign module, Tomb of Annihilation, where players trek out from a bustling city into a dangerous unknown wilderness, clearing hexes as they go. The West Marches is one of the most unique campaign styles, designed entirely to address the very common real-world problem of too many players and scheduling difficulties. That it can apply to and help so many playgroups is why it takes the number 2 spot on this list, though it doesn't apply to as many groups as the top spot on our list. Standing in tall at the number 1 spot on this list, we have the traditional open world campaign. This is quite possibly the most common campaign style. If you've ever watched Critical Role or played several of the branching style Wizards of the Coast campaign modules like Storm King's Thunder or Tyranny of Dragons, then you should be familiar with this. It's the easiest way to toss a bunch of players who aren't really sure what they want to do with their characters into a game as they come into their own. The premise is very simple. You've created a world vaguely detailed in its broad strokes and laid out for the players to interact with. Usually after they meet up in a tavern, you see what parts of the world the players become interested in and, in between sessions, create more details and encounters based on what random idea caught the player's attention. As with any open world game, the value of it comes in just how engaging the world is. You can create problems or conflicts as you think of them and introduce them whenever and wherever you want. A lot of intrigue, variety, and challenge can come in the fact that a pre-established world will have things too powerful or dangerous for the characters to solve at their current level, like stumbling into a high-level zone in an MMO or accidentally taking off a powerful NPC in a game. It's a big world, and the players, at least at first, are just small pieces in that story. One small downside of an open world campaign is that dungeon masters often have to implement railroading as the players will, by their very nature, veer off the path they were previously interested in and that you prepared for them. This takes them into areas or conflicts you might not have fleshed out enough and can diminish the quality or cause unwanted railroading. That makes the world campaigns great for 2 particular kinds of dungeon masters: those that absolutely love creating tons of world building content, and those that are comfortable with immense amounts of improvisation. The former can often create a world detailed enough that they rarely don't have something ready for whichever direction the chaotic players take, while the latter just happily makes things up as the players explore and sell it as good as if they had prepared it in advance. Open world D&D is one of the classic and most straightforward ways to run a game. It has a lot of design crossover with games people might already be familiar with, like RPGs. If you're not sure what style you want, open world is a great starting point. By its very nature, you can easily maneuver it into most other campaign styles if you want to mix it up after all, and that's why it takes number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other campaign styles or settings you like? Do you have any ideas for future D&D videos just like this one? If so, please leave your thoughts and comments down below.